On October 14, 1066, in a field south of London that would forever be known as Hastings, two armies stood face to face, knowing that by nightfall, one of two things would be decided. Either England would remain what it had been for 5 centuries, or it would become something it had never been before. More than 7,000 men on each side prepared to kill each other, not for land, not for gold, not even for God, but for the right to define what England meant. This was not a battle between neighbors or rivals. This was a war between worlds, between the last echo of the Viking age and the iron discipline of continental feudalism, between a kingdom that had survived wave after wave of invasion and a duke who had bet everything on one crossing, one landing, one fight. The man who wore England's crown had not slept in weeks. The man who wanted it had sailed across a sea that could have drowned his entire future. In the hours to come, one of them would be dead, and the other would rule an empire that would echo through 1,000 years of history. Everything that made England England was about to be destroyed. Everything that would replace it was about to be born, and none of the men standing in that cold October wind could stop what was coming. The morning air tasted of salt and iron. A ridge called Senlac Hill rose gently from the countryside, its slopes muddy from overnight rain, its crest crowned by a wall of shields that stretched wider than any man could see from end to end. Behind those shields stood the army of Harold Godwinson, King of England, exhausted, battered, but unbroken. They had marched over 250 miles in less than 2 weeks. They had fought a battle in the north that should have ended their war. They had watched their enemies die in a river choked with Norwegian corpses. And now, 5 days after the greatest victory of Harold's life, they stood on another battlefield, facing another army, knowing that victory this time would not come easy. Below the ridge, spread across the valley in perfect formation, was the army of William the Bastard, Duke of Normandy, a man who had survived assassination attempts as a child, rebellions as a young duke, and a sea crossing that everyone said was suicide. His knights sat on war horses bred for violence. His archers carried bows that could punch through oak. His infantry moved with the discipline of men who knew that failure meant death. Not just in battle, but in the cold political reality that awaited back in Normandy. William had burned his own ships. There was no retreat. There was no second chance. There was only England, or nothing. And between these two forces, between the last Anglo-Saxon king and the first Norman conqueror, there was only one question left unanswered. Who wanted it more? Harold Godwinson was not supposed to be king. He was not of royal blood. He was not chosen by prophecy or divine right. He was the son of Godwin, Earl of Wessex, the most powerful noble family in England, a family that had survived Viking invasions, Norman intrigues, and the chaos of weak kings by being smarter, faster, and more ruthless than everyone else. Harold had spent his life preparing for power without ever expecting the crown itself, serving as the right hand of Edward the Confessor, a king so obsessed with God that he forgot to secure a successor. When Edward died in January of 1066, England faced a vacuum. The old king's last words, whispered on his deathbed, supposedly named Harold as his heir. Within hours, Harold was crowned. Within days, every man with a claim to England sharpened his sword. Harold became king because England needed a king immediately, because waiting meant civil war, because the only thing worse than a disputed crown was no crown at all. But speed has a cost. Harold's coronation was legal, but it was not uncontested. He wore the crown, but half of Europe refused to recognize it. And now, less than a year into his reign, Harold stood on a muddy hill, knowing that if he lost this battle, history would not remember him as the man who saved England. It would remember him as the man who stole it and lost it in the same breath. Across the field, William of Normandy was something else entirely. He did not claim England by deathbed whispers or political maneuvering. He claimed it by oath, by promise, by the kind of cold legalism that made medieval Europe run on blood and paperwork. According to William, Edward the Confessor had promised him the English throne back in 1051, a promise made when William's influence was strong and England's future was uncertain. More than that, William claimed that Harold himself had sworn an oath years earlier, on holy relics no less, to support William's claim when the time came. Whether that oath was given freely or under duress, whether it was binding or coerced, no longer mattered. What mattered was that William had the Pope's blessing, a banner consecrated in Rome, and an army that believed God was on their side. He was not just invading England, he was executing a legal claim with 20,000 swords. And unlike Harold, who had inherited a kingdom, William had built his army from nothing, recruiting knights from Brittany, Flanders, France, and every corner of Europe, where men were willing to kill for land and titles. These were not defending their homeland. They were here to take one. William had spent months preparing, gathering ships, training men, waiting for the wind to turn. When he finally sailed, it was not with the hope of victory. It was with the certainty that there was no other choice. He had gambled everything. He had left Normandy vulnerable. He had committed his entire political future to a single throw of the dice. If he lost at Hastings, he would not return home to rebuild. He would be dead, forgotten, a footnote in the story of better men. So he sat on his warhorse that October morning, staring up at the ridge where Harold waited, and knew that only one of them would leave this field alive. But Harold and William were not the only men who wanted England in 1066. Before Hastings, before William ever set foot on English soil, there was another war, another invasion, another army that came within a single battle of tearing Harold's reign apart before it even began. In September of 1066, 3 weeks before Hastings, the North Sea filled with sails. Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, veteran of a dozen wars, conqueror of cities, the last great Viking warlord, descended on England with a fleet so massive that witnesses claimed it stretched from horizon to horizon. Hardrada did not care about oaths or papal blessings. He cared about conquest, about glory, about the kind of reputation that only comes from taking something that does not belong to you. And he was not alone, fighting. Beside him was Harold Godwinson, Harold's own brother, a man exiled from England, burning with resentment, willing to see his homeland destroyed if it meant destroying Harold with it. Together they landed in the north, smashed an English army at Fulford, and occupied York. The north was theirs, the kingdom was fracturing, and Harold, barely 9 months into his kingship, faced a nightmare. 2 invasions, 2 armies, 2 enemies who wanted him dead. He could not fight both. He had to choose. So he chose the closest threat. He marched north. On September 25, 1066, Harold Godwinson arrived at a place called Stamford Bridge and did something that should have been impossible. He surprised an army of battle-hardened Vikings who thought they were safe, who thought Harold was still in the south, who were resting by a river, their armor off, their guard down. Harold's army hit them like a hammer. The battle was chaos. Hardrada, one of the most feared warriors in Europe, was killed by an arrow to the throat. Tostig, Harold's own brother, died fighting to the last. The Norwegian army was annihilated. Of the 300 ships that had sailed to England, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. It was one of the most complete victories in medieval warfare. Harold had crushed an invasion that should have ended his reign before it truly began. He had killed a legend. He had avenged the North. And for a brief, glorious moment, it seemed like Harold Godwinson was the kind of king England needed, a warrior who could move fast, strike hard, and win against impossible odds. But victory has a cost. His army was exhausted, his best men were wounded, his supplies were running low, and while he celebrated in the ruins of the Viking army 500 miles to the south, William of Normandy was landing on the English coast. William had been waiting. For months he had sat in Normandy, watching the wind, waiting for the weather to turn, knowing that Harold's attention was divided, knowing that the longer Harold fought in the north, the weaker the south would become. When news reached William that Harold was marching to face Hardrada, he saw his opening. On September 28, 1066, just 3 days after Stamford Bridge, William's fleet crossed the Channel. He landed at Pevensey on the southern coast, in the heartland of Harold's own estates. He did not come as a conqueror unsure of his welcome. He came as a man who knew exactly what he was doing. He seized an old Roman fort, fortified it, and began systematically burning and pillaging the countryside. This was not random violence. This was a message. Every farm burned, every village sacked, every field destroyed belonged to Harold. William was daring him to come south. He was goading him. He was forcing his hand. And it worked. When Harold received word that Normandy had landed, that his lands were being destroyed, that William was fortifying positions and waiting for him, he had no choice. He could not wait. He could not let William dig in. He had to march again. So he turned his exhausted army around and began the long, brutal march back to the south. His men had just fought the battle of their lives. Now they were being asked to do it again. Harold reached London on October 6th. His army was a shadow of what it had been. Desertions had thinned the ranks. The rapid marches had broken men's bodies. The northern campaign had cost him his best warriors. And yet, Harold did not wait. He did not rest. He did not consolidate. He marched straight toward Hastings, gathering what forces he could along the way, knowing that every day he delayed gave William more time to fortify, more time to recruit, more time to turn southern England into a Norman stronghold. On the night of October 13th, Harold positioned his army on Senlac Hill, a ridge that gave him the high ground, a natural fortress of mud and slope that would force William to attack uphill, into a wall of shields, into the teeth of the Anglo-Saxon war machine. It was a good position. It was a defensible position, but it was also a desperate position. Harold's army numbered around 7,000 men, roughly the same size as William's, but William had something Harold did not. Time to prepare, time to rest, time to plan. Harold had arrived exhausted, his forces stretched thin, his options limited. He could not retreat. William would pursue. He could not wait. His army would dissolve. He could only fight. And so, as the sun set on October 13th, Harold stood on that ridge, looked down at the campfires of the Norman army spread across the valley below, and knew that tomorrow one kingdom would end and another would begin. There was no middle ground. There was no negotiation. There was only the battle. When dawn broke on October 14th, the battlefield was silent except for the sound of armor and prayer. The English had formed their shield wall along the crest of the ridge, a formation that had defended England for generations, a wall of overlapping shields backed by axes and swords, a living fortress designed to break cavalry charges and endure infantry assaults. Behind that wall stood the housecarls, Harold's elite warriors, professional soldiers who fought with two-handed axes that could split a horse in half, men who had survived Stamford Bridge, men who had followed Harold through blood and mud, and victory. Around them stood the fyrd, the militia levies, farmers and townsmen who owed military service, less experienced but no less determined, men who knew that if they lost, their homes would burn, their families would suffer, their entire way of life would end. They stood together, shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield, and waited. Below them, William's army prepared in 3 divisions. In the front, the archers, men with longbows and crossbows, their job to weaken the shield wall before the real assault began. Behind them, the infantry, armored foot soldiers meant to engage the English line and create openings. And behind them, the cavalry, the killing blow, knights on horseback who would exploit any break in the English formation and turn defense into slaughter. It was a combined arms approach, a modern military strategy that most of Europe had never seen. William was not just invading England, he was bringing a new kind of war. And Harold, standing at the center of his shield wall, knew that if that wall broke, the battle was over. William gave the order. The archers fired. The sky turned dark with arrows. They fell like rain onto the English line, clattering against shields, punching into wood, striking helmets and armor with the sound of hail on stone. Men screamed, men fell. But the shield wall held. The English crouched behind their defenses, enduring the storm, knowing that arrows could wound but not break them. When the volley ended, the archers fell back, and the infantry advanced. Thousands of Norman foot soldiers marched up the slope, their shields raised, their swords ready, and crashed into the English line with the sound of thunder. The ridge erupted into chaos. Axes swung, swords clashed, men screamed and died in the mud. The Norman infantry pushed forward, trying to find a weak point, trying to force a gap, but the English held. Every step forward cost the Normans blood. Every inch of ground was bought with corpses. The slope worked against them. The mud slowed them. The shield wall absorbed their assault like a stone wall absorbing waves. And then William unleashed his cavalry. Knights on war horses charged up the hill. Lances leveled, hooves tearing into the mud, crashing into the English line with the weight of steel and flesh. Horses reared. Men were trampled. Lances broke against shields, but the line held. The ridge was too steep. The ground was too unstable. The horses could not gain momentum. The charge that should have shattered the English instead ground to a halt, knights struggling to control their mounts, infantrymen dying in the press, the entire assault collapsing into a brutal, grinding stalemate. This was not how it was supposed to go. William had planned for a quick, decisive victory. Instead, he was watching his army bleed itself dry on a hill that refused to fall. Hours passed. The battle did not stop. It did not pause for breath or mercy. It simply continued, a relentless, grinding horror of violence that drained both armies of strength and will. Men fought until their arms went numb. They killed until they could not lift their swords. They screamed until their voices broke. And still, the shield wall held. William rode among his troops, trying to rally them, trying to keep the momentum, but morale was cracking. Then, in the midst of the chaos, a rumor spread through the Norman ranks like wildfire. William was dead. A knight had fallen. A commander had been struck down. In the confusion, men began to believe their duke had been killed. Panic set in. Units began to retreat. The left flank started to collapse. If the rumor held, if the army believed William was gone, the entire invasion would shatter. So William did the only thing he could. He rode to the front of his army, removed his helmet, and screamed at his men to look at him, to see that he was alive, to understand that the fight was not over. His face was visible. His voice was unmistakable. The panic stopped. The retreat halted. The army steadied. And in that moment, William understood something crucial. The English were not unbeatable, but they were disciplined. They would not break from fear. They would not abandon their position. They had to be tricked. William ordered a feigned retreat. It was a gamble, a tactic that required perfect coordination, perfect timing, and perfect trust. Units of Norman cavalry and infantry pretended to flee, turning their backs on the English, running down the slope as if the battle was lost. And the English, seeing their enemies break, seeing victory within reach, did what warriors have done since the beginning of time. They pursued. Parts of the shield wall fractured. Men broke formation, chasing the Normans down the hill, eager to finish the fight, to turn retreat into slaughter. But the retreat was a lie. The moment the English reached level ground, the Norman cavalry wheeled around and charged. The scattered English, isolated from their formation, cut off from support, were slaughtered in the open field. Axes that could break shields were useless against cavalry in open ground. The third, brave but untrained, died in droves. And when the survivors tried to retreat back up the hill, they found the gaps in the shield wall had not closed. The Normans pressed forward. The English line, once unbreakable, began to fracture. The battle shifted. What had been a stalemate became a crisis. What had been endurance became desperation. Harold's army was still fighting, still holding parts of the ridge, but the momentum had turned. The Normans were no longer throwing themselves against a wall. They were exploiting cracks, widening gaps, turning defense into collapse. As the sun began to set, the battlefield was a nightmare of mud and blood, and exhausted men too tired to do anything but keep killing. The English had fought for nearly 8 hours. The Normans had attacked for nearly 8 hours. Both armies were shadows of what they had been at dawn, but the English were breaking. Slowly, inevitably, the shield wall was crumbling. Harold's brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, were dead, killed in the fighting, their bodies lost somewhere in the chaos. The housecarls were dying, the best warriors England had, falling one by one under the weight of endless assault. And Harold, at the center of the line, fighting with the desperation of a man who knew that if he fell, everything fell with him, could not be everywhere at once. He could not hold the line by himself. He could not stop the collapse. And then, as dusk approached, something happened that would be remembered for 1,000 years. Something that would be painted in tapestries and argued over by historians and turned into legend even as it happened. Harold Godwinson, King of England, was struck down. The details are uncertain. Some say an arrow hit him in the eye. Some say he was cut down by Norman knights in the final push. Some say both. What is certain is that Harold died on that ridge. His body was hacked apart by Norman soldiers. His royal banner fell, and with his death, the last strength of the English army shattered. Men who had fought all day, who had endured arrows and cavalry, and the collapse of their formation, finally broke. They ran. They scattered into the forest. They abandoned the ridge. The battle was over. William of Normandy stood victorious on a hill soaked in blood. His army had won, but barely. Thousands of his men were dead. His cavalry was shattered. His infantry was exhausted. The victory was total, but it was not clean. England had not surrendered. It had been beaten into submission, one corpse at a time, 1 hour at a time, one terrible decision at a time. Harold's body was recovered, mutilated beyond recognition, identified only by markings known to his mistress. William ordered it buried in an unmarked grave. There would be no shrine. There would be no martyr. Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king, would be erased as thoroughly as his kingdom. But England did not fall in a day. Hastings was the beginning, not the end. For the next 5 years, William fought rebellion after rebellion, crushing resistance in the north, burning entire regions to the ground in what would be called the Harrying of the North, a campaign of deliberate starvation and destruction designed to break the spirit of the English people. He built castles across the country, stone fortresses that symbolized Norman power and Norman permanence. He replaced the English nobility with Norman lords. He reorganized the church under Norman bishops. He commissioned the Domesday Book, a survey so complete that it recorded every piece of land, every resource, every person of value in the entire kingdom. England was not conquered, it was dismantled and rebuilt. The England that existed before Hastings, the England of Alfred the Great, of Viking kings, of Anglo-Saxon culture and language and law, was gone. In its place rose a new England, an England tied to the continent, an England ruled by French-speaking lords, an England where power came not from ancient bloodlines, but from feudal contracts enforced by castles and knights. The language changed. Old English began to absorb Norman French, creating the hybrid tongue that would eventually become modern English. The culture changed. The aristocracy became bilingual, speaking French in court and English in the fields. The very identity of what it meant to be English shifted, no longer rooted in Anglo-Saxon tradition, but in a new Norman-imposed order. Hastings did not just decide who ruled England, it decided what England would become. And for the next 1,000 years, every king, every law, every war, every moment of English history would trace its roots back to that muddy ridge where Harold fell and William rose. The battle lasted less than a day. Its consequences lasted forever.